On December 18, 1948, in Burbank, California, Edmund Kemper III was born to parents Edmund and Clarnell Kemper. Even as a child, Edmund Kemper had the wish that everyone else in the world would die. Along with this, he would practice dismembering his sister's dolls, later stating, "I remember there was actually a sexual thrill. You hear that little pop and pull their heads off and hold their heads up by their hair. That'd get me off." However, this soon escalated to Edmund practicing on the family cats. On one occasion, he buried one alive. After some time, he dug the animal back up, cut through its neck, and then stuck its head on a stick. Eventually, the cat was replaced. This one too was tortured by Edmund, him stabbing it with a machete and soaking himself in the blood of the feline. Around the age of 8, his parents divorced and he went to live with his mother. It was there that he was frequently locked in the basement since his mother feared that Edmund would SA his sister. Down in the basement, the only things he had were his sleeping bag, cot, a single light bulb that hung from the ceiling, and the rats running through the darkness. Outside the basement, Kemper would face constant humiliation and rejection from his mother. The two would fight often, and later it was suspected that his mother suffered from borderline personality disorder. In fact, Edmund's father would later state that living with Clarnell was worse for his mental state than his time spent in war. Years later, it was discovered that the troubled boy actually had an IQ of 145. Despite this, he soon dropped out of high school at the age of 15 and ran away to his father, who he actually got along with. Unfortunately, when he got there, he found that his father had already remarried and there was no room for Edmund. This experience was just another rejection for him. Edmund was sent to live with his grandparents, who lived in a 17-acre ranch in the mountains. This might have been an ideal situation if it weren't for the fact that his grandmother reminded him of his mother. Before I start, consider helping keeping this channel running by donating to my Patreon. Either that, or consider buying my full-length novel. Right now on Amazon, the ebook version is only 99 cents or free if you have Kindle Unlimited. I'll get more into the novel later on. Both links will be in the description. And with that, let's begin. Edmund and Maud Kemper. On the first Christmas after Edmund arrived on the ranch, his grandfather bought him a .22 caliber rifle to shoot rabbits and other small animals. This became not only a hobby, but an outlet for his simmering anger. However, the rifle was soon taken away due to his grandmother not liking the killing of innocent wildlife. And with this, Edmund's dislike of his grandmother grew into pure hatred. On August 27, 1964, Edmund got into an argument with her as they sat at the kitchen table. As Maud worked on a children's book, Edmund retrieved the .22 caliber rifle, planning to cool off by going hunting for rabbits. It was here that his grandmother uttered the words, "You'd better not be shooting the birds again." Kemper froze in place, turned around, and took a look through the window. His grandmother was facing the opposite direction. He raised his rifle, aiming for her head, and fired through the screen. He fired 2 more times, hitting her again in the head and once in the back. From here, Kemper covered her head in a towel and dragged her body across the house to the back bedroom. Just to ensure she was dead, Kemper retrieved a knife and stabbed her 3 times. He had used so much force during the stabbing that the knife was bent when he was finished. A short time later, his grandfather returned from the grocery store, waving and smiling. Kemper went out to meet the elderly man. Once he was close enough, he lifted the rifle, aimed for his grandfather's head, and pulled the trigger. Edmund Kemper Sr.'s body would soon be dragged to the garage, all the blood being washed off with a garden hose. After this, Kemper called his mother, who then called the police. Once they arrived, they found Kemper on the front porch, who calmly stated, "I just wanted to see what it felt like to shoot Grandma." He would later explain that the reason he killed his grandfather is because he didn't want the elderly man to have to see his wife dead. Kemper would be arrested and eventually spend 5.5 years at the Uskatero State Hospital for the criminally insane. During his stay among 1,600 other inmates, Kemper would be given special privileges due to his good behavior. Soon he would use these privileges to go through records and test papers, memorizing the criteria for all the diagnoses. It is thought that he used this information to manipulate the staff into believing they had cured him. And with that, he was released on his 21st birthday. Marianne Pesce and Anita Lucchesa. After being released from the mental hospital, Kemper moved back in with his mother, who began her relentless ridicule of him. At one point, she gave Kemper a staff parking sticker from her job at the local university. Even with this, she made a point to tell him he would never attract any of the pretty girls at the college. In order to get back at her, Kemper began picking up female hitchhikers in an attempt to form relationships. Due to spending years locked away and his low self-esteem, he lacked the social skills necessary to make a friend, let alone a romantic partner. At the age of 23, he would finally have his first sexual experience. Unfortunately for him, the experience went terribly. Despite being 6'9", there was a certain part of him that was very small. This most likely not only crushed his already crippled self-esteem, but fueled the rage that had been brewing inside of him since he slept with the rats in his mother's basement. Following this, he picked up 2 hitchhikers on May 7th, 1972, Marianne Pesce and Anita Lucchesa. Kemper drove to an isolated location, turned off his car, and pulled out his gun. Along with this, Kemper had rigged his car doors in such a way that prevented them from being opened from the inside. He then tied up Anita and forced her into the trunk. Going back into the car, he made his way to the back seat, removing the clothes of Marianne. However, he was unable to complete the deed due to his sexual inexperience. This enraged him to no comparable degree. Kemper pulled out a knife and began violently stabbing the 18-year-old girl to death. As she bled out, he put the blade to her neck and slit her throat. When she was finally dead, he realized he would need to kill Anita so there would be no witnesses. He left the car and opened the trunk, convincing the girl that her friend was fine and that the blood was because he hit her during an argument. As she began to crawl out, he used the same knife to stab her. Once he was sure she was dead, he put both bodies in the trunk and then drove off. Kemper was soon stopped by a police officer due to having a broken taillight, but was only given a warning. He later stated that if the officer had requested to search his vehicle, he would have killed him as well. The 6'9" man made his way to his new apartment, dragged both girls inside, and then cut their heads off. After placing the heads into plastic bags, he put their limp bodies into his bathtub, cutting them both into pieces. During this time, he took many pictures of the blood and severed corpses, pleasuring himself throughout the ordeal. For several nights, he would sleep with the dismembered heads. Kemper would eventually put all the body parts into the trunk of his car before dumping them in random isolated locations. Even then, he still kept the decomposing heads of the girls in the trunk of his car, using them to pleasure himself with. Once they were too decayed for his liking, he dumped them in a ravine. Several months later, Marianne's decomposed head would be discovered by hikers. Anita's body has never been found. Before I go any further, I'd like to share an amazing novel on Amazon called The Junkyard Kids. With a bloodthirsty serial killer and a psychologically disturbed protagonist, this book is a tale of not only the most brutal sides of life this world has to offer, but one of redemption. After being homeless due to witnessing his parents' murder as a child, our protagonist and his younger brother group up with 3 other unwanted outcasts, eventually seeking shelter in a deserted junkyard. One night, two thugs stop by the junkyard. This leads him to not only witness another murder, but commit one in self-defense. Realizing the corrupt police officials of the city would never believe their story, he and his friends dump the bodies and the evidence in a nearby river. Unfortunately, they all realize they must leave the city, and soon. While attempting to escape, they stumble upon clues to the identity of the city's inactive serial killer, inadvertently resuming his killing spree in the process. Abandoning his original plan of escape, our protagonist decides to pursue the sadistic madman. I'm not going to go too deep and spoil the story, but I will say included in the novel are over 40 magnificent illustrations. As reader Loretta Lynn puts it, Junkyard Kids was a tale of the different variety, a dark, crazy variety, but oh man was it good. Regardless of if you buy this novel in hardback or ebook format, it does support the channel as well as myself. If you do make a purchase and enjoy the book, consider leaving a positive review on Amazon. I read all of them. Every review has a chance to be featured in one of my videos. And if this book sounds good, but you aren't sure, look for the thumbnail at the end of this video. It'll bring you to a reading of the first few chapters. With that being said, here's the next story. Aiko Coup. On September 14th, 1972, Kemper picked up 15-year-old Aiko Coup, who was on her way to dance class. She had missed the bus and decided to hitchhike when he offered her a ride. Her class was in San Francisco, but she soon realized something was wrong when he drove to an isolated location. When he pulled out his gun and showed it to her, she became hysterical. A short time after this, Kemper left his vehicle and locked himself out. Unfortunately, the teenage girl made the mistake of letting him back in. Soon, he put tape over her mouth and pinched her nostrils together until she suffocated. Once she was unconscious, he removed her clothing and SA'd her. He then strangled her to death. As with his previous victims, he took Aiko back to his apartment, cut her head off, and then dismembered her body in his bathtub. Kemper would also SA her corpse. He then dumped her body in another location, but again kept the head of his victim. With the head of Aiko in the trunk of his car, Kemper saw two doctors the next day. One stated, "I see no psychiatric reason to consider him to be a danger to himself or any other member of society." Both agreed that he was no longer a threat. A few days later, Kemper would bury the head of Aiko in his mother's garden. He would bury the rest of the body in his mother's backyard. A month later, Kemper's juvenile records would be sealed away, disallowing the public to know about his first two murders. Cindy Shaw. Around the time that Kemper was committing his murders, so was another serial killer in the same area by the name of Herbert Mullen. This made it difficult for police to establish which kills were being committed by whom. Despite all the murders, 19-year-old Cynthia Ann Shaw still accepted a ride from Edmund Kemper on January 8, 1973. Cynthia was a babysitter who was headed to class at Cabrillo College. During the ride, he would put his gun to her head and pull the trigger. Kemper would then drive Cindy's corpse back to his mother's home and then hid it in the house cupboard. When his mother went to work the next day, he dragged the body from the cupboard, had intercourse with it, and then carried it to the bathtub. It was here that he dismembered the body into pieces, letting the blood flow down the drain. After this, he used a knife to dig into her skull, removing the bullet fragments. Her body parts were put into plastic bags and disposed of along the coast. As for her head, Kemper buried it right outside his bedroom window to keep her close to him. Rosalind Thorpe and Allison Leo. Less than a month later, on February 5th, 1973, Kemper got into a heated argument with his mother. Angered by her verbal and emotional abuse, he headed out, telling her he was going to a movie theater. However, he later stated to police that the next good-looking girl he saw would die. Down the road, he would see one near a bus stop who accepted a ride from him. Rosalind Thorpe was a university student who had missed the last bus home on that rainy night. Kemper drove up next to her asking, "The bus is gone, I know. I've missed it before too. Can I give you a lift?" Rosalind entered the car, happy to get out of the rain. Only 2 blocks down the road, Kemper spotted Allison Leo, slowed down and offered the second girl a ride. Allison saw Rosalind in the front seat as well as the university staff sticker on the car. Thinking she was safe, she got in the car without a second thought. Kemper continued down the road. Then, without warning, he pulled out his gun and shot Rosalind. The 23-year-old university student slumped back in her seat. Kemper then turned around and fired through the hands of Allison, who was now frantic. With another shot, he sent a bullet through her head. As blood poured out onto the car seat, she moaned loudly. He shot her again, killing her. From here, he took the 2 corpses back to his mother's house, who he was living with again. Kemper had intercourse with Allison's body and then removed the bullet from the head of Rosalind. As usual, he placed the dead bodies in his bathtub and dismembered them. Once morning came, he drove around Alameda County, tossing the body parts into the hills as well as the ocean. 2 weeks later, a road crew would find what was originally thought to be 2 mannequins. Once they got closer, they found that it was the decomposing, mangled corpses of the missing girls. Along with this, random body parts began appearing around the area. However, many body parts were never found. It was later discovered that Kemper had been consuming them. Kemper would strip the flesh from his victims, bake it into a casserole, and eat it. Sally Hallett and Ed Kemper's mother, Clarnell Strandberg. A short time later, police would receive notice that Kemper had purchased a gun despite not legally being allowed to own one. 2 officers made their way to his house, finding Kemper in his car. They then requested he turn over the revolver, eventually took it and headed back to the station. Despite the 2 officers having no clue that he was the serial killer, this event led Kemper to become paranoid. He soon became convinced that they knew he was the murderer and were messing with him. On April 20th, 1973, Kemper came home from work and checked in with his mother, hoping she would say something nice. Instead, she said, "Oh my God, now I suppose you're going to want to stay up and talk all night." Later on, at approximately 5 a.m., Kemper crept into his mother's room, using a claw hammer to cave in the side of her head. Even though she was most likely dead at this point, he took a knife and slit open her throat. After this, he used her head to pleasure himself with, placed it on a mantle, and then used it as a dartboard. For over an hour, he screamed at the severed head before smashing her face in. Finally, he cut out her tongue and vocal cords before putting them in the garbage disposal. However, the garbage disposal wasn't able to break down the vocal cords, and they were eventually expelled back into the sink. After this, Kemper hid his mother's body in a closet, cleaned himself up, and then went to a local bar. It was there that he found his mother's 59-year-old best friend, Sally Hallett, and invited her back to his home for dinner. Once the 2 entered the home, Kemper put her in a chokehold and lifted her up in the air, breaking her neck. He would later state, "I squeezed and I just lifted her off the floor. She just hung there, and for a moment, I didn't realize she was dead. I had broken her neck, and her head was just wobbling around with the bones of her neck disconnected in the skin sac of her neck." For the rest of the night, Kemper would have intercourse with her dead body. Eventually, he would drag both bodies to the bedroom, put them on top of the bed, and dismember them. The mattress, being soaked with blood, was flipped over to hide the massive bloodstains. Both bodies were stuffed into a closet and a sheet was placed over them. Once he was finished, he took Sally's car and drove off. The arrest of Edmund Kemper. Kemper would drive to Nevada in Sally's car, rent a Chevy Impala, and then continue on to Colorado. On April 23, 1973, he called the police from a payphone, confessing to all the murders. Eventually, officers would arrest the 6'9" serial killer who did not resist arrest. During trial, Kemper would plead not guilty by reason of insanity. Despite this, he'd be sentenced to life in prison. To this day, he resides at the California Medical Facility where he shared his prison block with Charles Manson and Herbert Mullen before their deaths. If you enjoyed this, consider checking out my other videos and subscribing. Videos come out every Friday on this channel. That's all I have for now. See you next time.